All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to read chapter two of Selma Lagerlöf's book, The Saga of Gösta Berling. The title of the second chapter is The Beggar. One cold day in December, a beggar came wandering up the hills of Broby. It's a little village. It's called Broby. He was dressed in the shabbiest rags, and his shoes were so worn that his feet were wet from the cold snow. Leuven is a long, narrow lake in the province of Värmland. You know what they say? They say that, there is just one long, narrow lake in the province of Värmland. Its name is Friken, and my own ancestors lived in the Friken Valley for hundreds of years before a couple of them decided to move off to Minnesota. So this book is actually about the happenings on the shores of this lake, the long lake Friken, but in this book they call it Leuven. Leuven is a long, narrow lake in the province of Värmland, laced up in a few places by long, narrow straits. To the north, it extends up towards the forests of Finnmark. To the south, down toward Vänern, right? So if you don't know Sweden, there is a huge forest there. They call it Finnmark. And long ago, in the 1600s, then the king of Sweden, he brought some Finns over and planted them in the forest there because they knew how to work the forest and make some things that the king needed, like he needed pitch from pine forests in order to seal his boats for the navy, right? And the Finns knew how to cook up pine wood and get the pitch out and sell this to the king, right? And they knew how to make charcoal. And if you're going to make iron, of course, you need charcoal in order to make iron. And so the Finns knew how to do that as well. And so these people are still living there today. Yeah, there's Finnish people, Finnish-speaking people still in those woods today from those original ones that the king moved over. And then Vänern, that's one of the largest lakes in Sweden. So there's a town called Karlstad. The bishop was sitting in Karlstad. So that's down to the south. There's this long lake, there's a river, and then you get to the town of Karlstad. One of our ancestors also came from Karlstad and Kiel and so on there. Okay, now, several parishes spread out along the shores of the lake, but Bro parish is the largest and the wealthiest. The word bro means bridge, right? No, sorry. It is a brother or bridge. Yeah. Bro parish is the largest and wealthiest. It occupies a good part of the shores of the lake on both east and west side, but the largest farmsteads are on the west side. Manor houses, such as Ekeby and Bjarne, widely known for wealth and beauty, and the large village of Broby, with its inn, courthouse, sheriff's residence, parsonage, and marketplace. So there is a place in the middle of this long lake where, the eastern and the western shores come together, and you just have a little river in the middle there. And that's the town where Selma Lagerlöf was from, right? So they're calling it Bridgetown or something. That's right, Broby. All right, Broby sits on a steep incline. The beggar had gone past the inn, which sits at the foot of the hill, and was plodding up towards the parsonage, which sits farthest up. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm just going to interrupt the book. The story is so good. So we have a beggar, and the beggar is in the town of Broby, right? And there's a church in Broby. All right, I'll shut up. Walking ahead of the beggar on the hill was a little girl who was pulling a sled loaded with a sack of flour. The beggar caught up with the girl and started talking with her. "Such a little horse for such a big load," he said. The child turned around and looked at him. She was a little thing, 12 years old, with piercing sharp eyes and a pinched mouth. "God grant that the horse were smaller and the load larger. Then it would last that much longer," the little girl replied. "Is this your own fodder that you're dragging home then?" said the beggar. "God help me, but I have to get my food myself, little as I am," said the girl. The beggar took hold of the sled handle to push it. The girl turned around and looked at him. "You mustn't think that you'll get anything for it," she said. The beggar started to laugh. You must be the daughter of the minister at Broby. Yes, yes, so I am. Many a girl has a poorer father. No one has a worse one. That's the plain truth, though it's a shame that his own child should have to say it. He sounds stingy and mean, this father of yours. He is stingy and he is mean, but his daughter will likely be even worse if she lives, people say. I think people are right. I would just like to know where you came across that sack of flour. Well, there won't be any harm in telling you about it. I took grain from Father's grain bin this morning, and now I've been to the mill. Oh, what a poor girl. She has to go get the grain milled herself by stealing the grain from her own father to get the flour so she can bake some bread so she can have something to eat. That's tough days. Won't he see you when you come dragging it home with you? You must have left your master too soon. Father is away visiting a sick person, don't you see? Someone is driving up the hill behind us. I hear the creaking from under the runners. What if it's him who's coming? The girl listened, peering, and then she started to wail. It's Father, she sobbed. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. Well now, good counsel is hard to find, and quick thinking is better than silver and gold, said the beggar. Look, said the child, you can help me. Take the rope and pull the sled, and then Father will think that it's yours. Then what should I do with it? Asked the beggar, putting the rope across his shoulders. Pull it wherever you want to for now, but come up to the parsonage with it when it gets dark. You can be sure I'll be watching you. You must come with the sack and the sled. Do you understand? I'll have to try, he said. God have mercy on you if you don't come, called the girl, as she ran away from him, hurrying home before her father. The beggar turned the sled with a heavy heart and pushed it down to the inn. The poor wretch had had a dream as he walked in the snow with half-naked feet. He had been thinking about the great forests north of Leuven, about the great Finnmark forests. Down here in Bro parish, where he was now traveling along the strait that connects upper and lower Leuven, yeah, so it is in the middle of the lake there, right? In these parts, renowned for wealth and joyfulness, with estate next to estate, ironworks by ironworks, here every road was too heavy for him, every room too narrow, every bed too hard. Here he must bitterly long for the peace of the great, endless forests. Here he could hear flails pounding at every barn, as if the grain would never be completely threshed. Loads of timber and charcoal wagons came unceasingly down from the inexhaustible forests. Endless ore carts traversed the roads in deep tracks, which hundreds of predecessors had carved out. Here he saw sledges filled with passengers hurry between the farms, and it seemed to him as though joy were holding the reins and beauty and love were standing on the runners. Oh, how the poor wretch longed to be up in the peace of the great endless forests. He can't stand the happiness of the town. Over there, where the trees stand up straight like pillars from an even ground, where the snow rests in heavy layers on the motionless branches, where the wind is powerless, only playing quietly in the topmost needles. There he wished to wander farther and farther in, until one day his strength would fail him, and he would fall down under the great trees, dying of hunger and cold. He longed for the great murmuring grave above Leuven, where he would be overpowered by the forces of a disintegration, where hunger, cold, weariness, and liquor would finally succeed in killing this poor body, which could endure anything. He had arrived at the inn. There he would wait for evening. He went into the serving room and sat in dull repose on the bench by the door, dreaming of the endless forests. The proprietress took pity on him and gave him a dram of liquor. She even gave him two, because he asked so eagerly. But more than that she would not give him, and the beggar fell into drunken despair. He must drink more of this strong, sweet liquor. He must once again feel his heart dance in his body, and his thoughts flare in intoxication. Oh, this sweet grain wine! Summer sun, summer bird song, summer scent and beauty were floating around in its white wake. One more time before he vanishes in night and darkness. He wants to drink sun and happiness. So first he traded away the flower, and then the flour sack, and finally the sled for liquor. From this he got good and drunk, and slept away a good part of the afternoon on a bench at the inn. When he awoke, he realized that there was only one thing left for him to do. Because this wretched body had taken all dominion over his soul, because he could drink up what a child had entrusted to him, because he was a disgrace to the earth, he must free it from the burden of so much wretchedness. He must give freedom back to his soul and let it go to God. Lying on the bench in the inn, he judged himself, Gösta Berling, defrocked minister, accused of having drunk up the flower of a hungry child, sentenced to death. Death by what means? Death in the snowdrifts. He seized his cap and stumbled out. He was neither completely awake nor completely sober. He wept in pity for himself, for his pitiful, soiled soul, which he must set free. He did not go far, and he did not stray from the road. By the roadside itself there was a high snowdrift. There he threw himself down to die. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. No one knows how long he lay like that, but there was still life in him, when the daughter of the Broby minister came running along the road with a lantern in her hand, and found him in the drift by the roadside. She had stood for hours waiting for him, and now she had run up the hills of Broby, trying to find him. She recognized him at once, and then she started shaking him and shouting with all her might to get him to wake up. She had to know what he had done with her sack of flour. She had to call him back to life, at least long enough so that he could tell her what had become of her sled and her flour sack. Dear father would kill her if she had frittered away his sled. She bit the beggar on the finger and clawed him in the face, all the while shrieking in despair. Then someone came driving up the road. "Who the hell is it who's shrieking?" came a gruff voice. "I want to know what this fellow has done with my flour sack and with my sled," sobbed the child, pounding with clenched fists on the beggar's chest. "Are you clawing a frozen person like that? Up with you, wildcat!" The rider was a tall, heavy-set woman. She got out of the sledge and walked over to the drift. She took the child by the neck and tossed her up on the road. After that, she leaned over, stuck her arms under the beggar's body, and lifted him up. And then she carried him to the sledge and laid him on it. "Come along into the inn, wildcat," she called to the minister's daughter, "so we can hear what you know about this business." An hour later, the beggar was sitting on a chair by the door in the best room of the inn, and the commanding woman who had rescued him from the snowdrift was standing in front of him. The way Gösta Berling saw her now, on the way home from a charcoal run in the forest, with sooty hands and a chalk pipe in her mouth, dressed in a short, unlined sheepskin and striped, hand-woven wool skirt, with brogues on her feet and a knife sheath across her chest. The way he saw her with gray hair brushed straight back over an aged, beautiful face, this was the way he had heard her described 1,000 times, and he realized that he had met up with the renowned Majoress of Ekeby, right? So she owns this estate or farm called Ekeby, or owns, there's a major, the the owner, the man and the wife who own Akaby, the major and the majoress. She was the most powerful woman in Värmland, the sovereign of 7 ironworks, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, and he was only a wretched man under a death sentence, bereft of everything, knowing that every road was too heavy for him and every room too confined. His body shivered with terror while her gaze rested upon him. She stood silently, looking at the human wretchedness before her, the swollen red hands, the emaciated countenance, and the splendid head, which even in decline and negligence radiated a wild beauty. "So this is Gösta Berling, the mad minister," she said inquiringly. The beggar sat motionless. "I am the majoress at Akaby." A shiver passed through the beggar's body. He clasped his hands, raising his eyes in a longing gaze. What would she do with him? Would she force him to live? He shuddered before her strength, and yet he had been so close to reaching the peace of the endless forests. She began the struggle by telling him that the daughter of the Broby minister had got back her sled and flour sack, and that she, the majoress, had a refuge for him, as for many another homeless wretch, in the Cavalier's wing at Akaby. So that's like, a cavalier, that's the horseman in the army. So if you're like a retired soldier, maybe you get a small amount of money or something as a pension from the soldier, and then she puts these people up in her home in the cavalier's wing. She offered him a life of play and pleasure, but he replied that he must die. Then she struck the table with her fist and let him hear her unvarnished thoughts. "So then, he wants to die, so that's what he wants. I wouldn't wonder much about that, if only he were alive. Look, such an emaciated body and such powerless limbs and such dull eyes, and he thinks he has something left to kill. Do you think you have been lying stiff and cold, nailed under a coffin lid, to be dead? Don't you think I can see how dead you are, Gösta Berling? I see that you have a skull for a head, and I can picture the worms creeping out of your eye sockets. Don't you feel that your mouth is full of dirt? Don't you hear how your bones rattle when you move? You have drowned yourself in liquor, Gösta Berling, and dead you are. The only life left in you is in your skeleton, and you won't begrudge those bones the chance to live, if you call that living. It's as if you would begrudge the dead a dance over the grave mounds in the starlight. Are you ashamed of having been defrocked, since you now want to die? I will tell you, there would be more honor in using your gifts and becoming something useful on God's green earth. Why didn't you come to me at once? Then I would have put everything right again for you. Yes, I suppose you must be expecting a great honor from being shrouded and laid out on sawdust and called a beautiful corpse. The beggar sat calm, almost smiling, while she thundered out her angry words. No danger, he rejoiced. No danger. The endless forests are waiting, and she has no power to turn my soul away from there. But the majoress fell silent and paced a few times back and forth in the room. Then she took a seat by the stove and put her feet up on the hearth and rested her elbows on her knees. Hell's bells, she said, chuckling to herself. What I'm saying is truer than I realize myself. Don't you think, Gösta Berling, that most people in this world are dead, or half dead? Do you think I'm living? Oh my, no. Oh my, no. Yes, look at me, you. I am the majoress at Akaby, and I am no doubt the most powerful woman in Värmland. If I wave my finger, the governor comes running, and if I wave 2 fingers, the bishop comes running, and if I wave 3, then consistory and aldermen and all the mill owners in Värmland dance a polska on the square in Karlstad. Hell's bells, lad, I'm telling you that I am nothing more than a dressed-up corpse. God knows how little life there is in me. The beggar leaned forward on the chair and listened with senses alert. The old majoress sat rocking before the fire. She did not look at him as she spoke. "Don't you think," she continued, "that if I were a living person who saw you sitting there, worthless and wretched, contemplating suicide, don't you think I could take those thoughts from you in a breath? Then I would have tears for you, and prayers going up one side and down the other, and I would save your soul. But I am dead. Have you heard that I was once the beautiful Margareta Selsing? That wasn't yesterday, but I can still cry my old eyes out over her. Why should Margareta Selsing be dead, and Margareta Samzelius live? Why should the majoress at Ekeby live? Tell me, Gösta Berling. Do you know what Margareta Selsing was like? She was slim and slender and shy and innocent, Gösta Berling. She was the sort on whose grave the angels weep. She knew nothing of evil. No one had done her sorrow. She was good to everyone, and she was beautiful, truly beautiful. There was a stately man. His name was Altringer. God knows how he happened to be traveling up there in the wilds of Älvdalen, where her parents had their ironworks. Margareta Selsing saw him. He was a handsome, stately man, and he loved her. But he was poor, and they agreed to wait for each other for 5 years, as the ballad says. When 3 years had passed, she had another suitor. He was ugly and mean, but her parents thought he was rich, and they forced Margareta Selsing by hook and by crook, with blows and harsh words, to take him as her husband. You see, on that day, Margareta Selsing died. Since then, there has been no Margareta Selsing, only Majoress Samzelius. And she was not good, not shy. She believed in much that was evil and gave no heed to what was good. I'm sure you know what happened next. We were living at Frö by Löven here, the major and I. But he was not rich, like people said. I often had difficult days. Then Altringer came back, and now he was rich. He became the master at Ekeby, which borders on Frö. He made himself master over 6 other ironworks on Löven. He was capable, enterprising. He was a wonderful man. He helped us in our poverty. We rode in his wagons. He sent food to our kitchen, wine to our cellar. He filled my life with banquets and amusements. The major went off to war, but what did we care about that? Oh, it was like a long dance of amusements around the shores of Löven. But there was evil talk about Altringer and me. If Margareta Selsing had been alive then, this would have caused her great sorrow, but it was nothing to me. I did not yet understand, however, that it was because I was dead that I had no feelings. Then the talk about us came up to my father and mother, where they lived among the charcoal stacks in the forests of Älvdal. The old woman did not hesitate long. She came down here to talk to me. One day, when the major was away and I was sitting at table with Altringer and several others, my mother came traveling. I saw her enter the dining room, but I could not feel that she was my mother, Gösta Berling. I greeted her as if she were a stranger, and invited her to sit down at my table and take part in the meal. She wanted to talk to me as if I had been her daughter. But I said to her that she was mistaken. My parents were dead. They had both died on my wedding day. A lot of anger in this family. Then my mother went along with the game. She was 70 years old, and she had ridden more than 120 miles in 3 days. Now she sat down at the dining table without further ado and helped herself to some food. She was a very strong person. She said that it was unfortunate that I had suffered such a loss on just that day. The most unfortunate thing, I said, was that my parents hadn't died the day before. Then the wedding would not have taken place. Are you not content with your marriage, gracious majoress? She then asked. Yes, I said, now I am content. I will always be content and obey the will of my dear parents." She asked if it had been my parents' will that I should heap shame upon myself and them and betray my husband. I showed little honor to my parents by letting myself be talked about by one and all. They made their bed. Now let them lie in it, I answered her. And besides, you, strange woman, should understand that I do not intend to allow anyone to defame my parents' daughter. We ate, the two of us. The men around us sat silently and did not dare raise knife and fork. The old woman stayed a day to rest, and then she left. But as long as I saw her, I could not understand that she was my mother. I knew only that my mother was dead. As she was about to leave, Gösta Berling, and I was standing beside her on the stair, and the wagon had pulled up, my mother said to me, "I have been here a whole day without you greeting me as your mother. On desolate roads I traveled here, more than 120 miles in 3 days, and my body trembles with shame for your sake, as if it were being whipped with branches. May you be denied, as I have been denied, disowned, as I have been disowned. May the highway be your home, the haystack your bed, the charcoal pile your stove. Shame and disgrace be your wage. May others strike you as I strike you." And she gave me a hard slap on the cheek. But I lifted her up, carried her down the stairs, and set her in the wagon. "Who are you to curse me?" I asked. "Who are you to strike me? I won't tolerate that from anyone." And I gave her a slap in return. The wagon left at once, but then, at that moment, Gösta Berling, I knew that Margareta Selsing was dead. She was good and innocent. She knew nothing of evil. The angels wept on her grave. If she had lived, she would not have struck her mother. The beggar over by the door had listened, and for a moment the words had deadened the sound of the enticing murmur of the endless forests. Look, look at this powerful woman. She made herself his equal in sin, his sister in perdition, to give him courage to live. Thus would he learn that there was sorrow and guilt on other heads than his. He got up and went over to the majoress. "Now will you live, Gösta Berling?" she asked with a voice that broke into tears. "What should you die for? A good minister might well have been made of you, but never was the Gösta Berling that you drowned in liquor so gleamingly innocent white as the Margareta Selsing that I smothered in hatred. Will you live?" Gösta fell down on one knee before the majoress. "Forgive me," he said, "I cannot." "I am an old woman, tempered by much sorrow," answered the majoress, "and I am sitting here laying bare my soul to a beggar whom I found half frozen in a snowdrift by the side of the road. It serves me right. If you go and become a suicide, then at least you cannot tell anyone about my craziness." "Majoress, I am no suicide. I am a doomed man. Don't make the fight too hard for me. I must not live. My body has taken dominion over my soul, so I must let him go free. Let him go to God." "I see. Do you think that's where you're going?" "Farewell, majoress, and thanks. Farewell, Gösta Berling." The beggar got up and went toward the door with hanging head and dragging steps. This woman made the road up to the great forests heavy for him. When he came to the door, he had to look back. Then he met the gaze of the majoress, where she sat quietly looking at him. He had never seen such a transformation in a face, and he remained standing and stared at her. She, who had just been enraged and threatening, sat in quiet transfiguration, and her eyes shone with merciful, compassionate love. There was something within him, in his own uncivilized heart, which burst at that gaze. He leaned his head against the doorpost, extended his arms over his head, and wept until his heart would have burst. The majoress tossed her chalk pipe into the stove and came over to Gösta. Her movements were suddenly as tender as a mother's. There, there, my boy. And she pulled him down alongside her on the bench by the door, so that he wept with his head against her lap. Are you still going to die? Then he wanted to leap to his feet. She had to hold him back by force. Now I say to you that you may do as you wish, but I promise you that if you want to live, then I will take the Broby minister's daughter to me and make a person out of her, so that she can thank her God that you stole her flower. So, will you? He lifted his head and looked her right in the eyes. Do you mean it? Yes, I do, Gösta Berling. Then he wrung his hands in anguish. He saw before him those piercing eyes, the pinched lips, and the emaciated little hands. So the young creature would get protection and care, and the marks of degradation would be erased from her body, the evil from her soul. Now the road up to the endless forests was closed to him. I will not kill myself as long as she is under the majoress's care, he said. I knew well enough that the majoress would force me to live. I knew right away that the majoress was too much for me. Gösta Berling, she said solemnly, I have fought for you as though for myself. I said to God, if there is anything of Margareta Celsing alive in me, then allow her to come forth and show herself, so that this man may not go and kill himself. And he allowed it, and you saw her, and therefore you could not go. And she whispered to me that at least for the sake of the poor child, you ought to give up your intent to die. Oh, you may fly boldly, you wild birds, but our Lord knows the net that will catch you. He is a great and strange God, said Gösta Berling. He has eluded me and rejected me, but he will not let me die. His will be done. From that day on, Gösta Berling became a cavalier at Ekeby. Twice he tried to get away from there and make his own way, to live off of his own labor. The first time, the majoress granted him a cottage near Ekeby. He moved there, intending to live as a laborer. He succeeded for a time, but soon tired of the loneliness of the daily toil, and again became a cavalier. The second time was when he became a tutor at Borg for Count Henrik Dona. During that time, he fell in love with the young Ebba Dona, the count's sister. But when she died, During that time, he fell in love with the young Ebba Dona, the count's sister. But when she died, just as he thought he was close to winning her, he gave up every thought of being anything other than a cavalier at Ekeby. It seemed to him that for a defrocked minister, all roads to rehabilitation were closed. All right, that was chapter 2, called The Beggar, of Selma Lagerlöf's book, The Saga of Gösta Berling.